Born very ugly, abandoned by his parents, 15 years later the boy is something that no one would ever have imagined. But to understand how it all happened, we need to go back in time. Back to a silent dawn in a private hospital in the city of Boston, Massachusetts, where it all began. The rain was beating lightly on the window, and the overcast sky seemed to cry along with that newborn who had just come into the world. Sergio was born with a dark mark on the right side of his face, a large spot that covered part of his cheek and spread to near his eye. For the doctors, it was something common. For the parents, it was a sentence. Before I continue, I want to ask you one thing. If you value real and moving stories like this video and subscribe to the channel. Here, each chapter can change the way you see life. Bruno and Corinne Silva were influential, rich people, accustomed to luxurious parties, international travel, and impeccable appearances. When they looked at their son for the first time, they didn't see a life. They saw shame. They saw a flaw. And they made a cruel decision. That same night, while Sergio was still crying in his crib, they signed legal documents and handed him over to the hospital, claiming they were unable to care for the child. It was a lie. They had everything, except humanity. But life, in its strange way of writing stories, placed Sergio in the hands of another woman. A nurse, moved by the absurd scene, refused to see that baby sent to a state shelter. She took him to a simple village on the outskirts of Boston and handed him over to a poor woman, but with the most generous heart anyone had ever seen. Her name was Maria. She lived alone in a small wooden house with the bare minimum to survive. But when she took that baby in her arms, she did not hesitate. "You are mine now, and I will love you, even if the world says I won't." The following years were marked by struggle, exclusion, and pain. The village where they lived was isolated, and Sergio's appearance had been drawing attention since he was little. The other children laughed, pointed, and avoided playing with him. He grew up with cruel nicknames and disgusted looks. And the worst was yet to come. Lucio, an arrogant and aggressive teenager, lived nearby. Always teasing, always humiliating. No one knew, not even he, that he was Sergio's biological brother. But he seemed to carry an instinct for rejection. He made Sergio's life hell. Pushing, cursing, threatening. Every day, Maria did everything she could to protect him. She taught him with sweetness, firmness, and faith. "You're still going to grow up, my son. Not because of your face, but because of your soul." These words were repeated over and over, like a mantra that sustained Sergio on the hardest days. But life doesn't always spare the good ones. And on a cold winter morning, Sergio tried to wake Maria. She didn't move. She was cold, serene, as if she were sleeping soundly. Maria had left. Alone, in silence, without saying goodbye. Sergio was left without ground, without anyone. At 15 years old, the world seemed colder than ever. But in that moment of loss, he made a decision that would change everything. He would leave. He would run away. He would start over. With an old backpack and some hidden money that Maria had saved, he boarded an interstate bus. The destination, Washington, D.C. There he believed he could be just another face in the crowd. There, perhaps, his story could truly begin. And this is just the first part. Sergio's journey is just beginning. A true story of abandonment, pain, courage, and overcoming. If you want to follow every step of this impressive transformation, don't miss the next parts. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Because what comes next will move you even more. Because sometimes life rejects us. But it's up to us to decide whether we're going to sink or become greater than everything they tried to make us believe. The trip to Washington was long, silent, full of jumbled thoughts and memories that burned in his chest. Sergio was only 15 years old, but his eyes already reflected the weight of someone who had lived much more than that. He looked out the bus window, as if searching for something, maybe a sign, maybe hope. Maybe he just wanted to forget. He arrived in the capital of the United States with his face covered by a beanie and a makeshift scarf. He didn't want anyone looking at him or asking questions. He walked through the icy streets carrying an old backpack and a name that no one knew. Sergio had nowhere to go, but he decided he wouldn't go back. It didn't matter how much it hurt. There he would start from scratch. In the first few days, he slept in public shelters and churches that offer hot food and a makeshift mattress. He didn't talk much. He observed. He tried to understand how this city, so different from the village where he had grown up, worked. Everything was fast, impersonal, and yet there were opportunities there. He discovered a community center that offered night classes for homeless youth. He signed up with the few documents he had and began to study. Even when he was hungry, cold, and ignored, he was there, listening to every word, absorbing everything. It was the beginning of something he himself did not yet understand. During the day, he did odd jobs. He washed dishes in a cafeteria, swept the sidewalk outside a store, carried boxes at a local market. Every penny he saved was treated like gold. Sergio learned to survive, yes, but above all, he learned to resist, to endure. Loneliness was still his shadow. Sometimes at night, he remembered the smell of Maria's coffee, her voice singing softly to distract him from his pain. At those times, he would cry quietly, hidden, like he used to when he was a child. But then he would dry his eyes and carry on. He always carried on. One of the teachers at the community center noticed something different about Sergio. He was quiet, but intelligent. He had a way of concentrating that drew attention. When asked what he wanted to be, he answered almost in a whisper, "A doctor." Some laughed. Others ignored him. But that teacher, named Thomas, didn't forget. Thomas began to guide him more closely. He gave him books, suggested scholarships, helped translate documents. That was how, 2 years later, Sergio managed to get into a support program for underprivileged young people so that he could complete high school and prepare for university exams. No one there knew what he had been through, but everyone knew that he was different. Even though he faced prejudice because of the mark on his face, Sergio no longer hid. He discovered that the world is too big to live in shame of who you are. He carried the pain of abandonment on his face, but in his eyes there was something that no one could erase. Once during a biology class, Sergio saw an image of skin reconstruction on a burn patient. He was mesmerized. The teacher noticed. After class, he asked her all about that surgery. It was as if something had awakened inside him. For the first time, he saw himself doing something that combined pain and healing, past and future. From that day on, he decided he would be a plastic surgeon. Not for vanity, not for status, but because he knew, like few others, what it was like to carry in your body a story that people don't want to see. He wanted to give others what no one had given him, dignity. The nights of studying became longer. The jobs doubled. He didn't complain. He knew he was fighting not only to win, but to prove to himself and to the world that he was not what his parents said he was. The mark on his face was still there, but now he carried it with honor. It was the reminder of everything he had survived, of everything that made him strong. He learned to love his own scar, and that was the first miracle. This was the second part of Sergio's story. If you've come this far, it's because something inside you connected with this truth. So like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. We still have a lot to tell, because sometimes pain defines us. But in some cases, it is pain that shapes us to be exactly who we need to be. The seasons passed like pages in a book he wrote with his own effort. The cold in Washington was still biting, but didn't hurt as much as before. Sergio now shared a small rented room with 2 other students, and the cramped space was a luxury compared to the sidewalks where he had slept. The student support program gave him access to a library and daily meals. For the first time, he had a bed, a table to study at, and a place where he could close his eyes without fear. And even though everything was still difficult, Sergio woke up before sunrise. He worked at a community hospital as a cleaning assistant. It wasn't glamour. It was persistence. There, cleaning hallways, listening to conversations, watching doctors and nurses save lives from afar, he felt he was in the right place. He was invisible to most, but he paid attention to everything. Every procedure, every shift change, every expression of relief or pain on the patients' faces. One night, when he was leaving the hospital, Sergio saw a man sitting on the floor, leaning against a wall, his face covered in open wounds. The man was crying softly, ashamed. No one stopped. No one looked. But Sergio knelt there, asked if he needed help, and offered the only thing he had, to listen. That morning, he returned home thoughtful. He remembered Maria. How she looked at him when no one else wanted to look. And he understood, perhaps for the first time clearly, that he wanted to give back to the world what he had received from a simple woman, a look of humanity. That was the same year that he took the university entrance exam. He had everything against him: a foreign accent, a history of dropping out, a scar on his face, the lack of a recognized surname. But he also had something rare, a story that no one could ignore. In the final interview, they asked him why he wanted to study medicine. He answered, "Because I know what it's like to be considered irreparable, and I want to prove that no one is." There was silence. Then, tears in the eyes of one of the evaluators. Sergio was accepted with a full scholarship. The university routine was brutal. Intense studies, long days in a lab, sleepless nights. But Sergio faced it all with the same spirit he had when he swept the cafeteria floor or slept on a church bench. The difference now was that he had a clear purpose: to rebuild what the world had broken in people, starting with himself. He did an internship with burn and facial trauma specialists. He watched surgeries with an almost religious concentration. It was like seeing miracles happening before his eyes. But what impressed him most were not the scalpels or the stitches. It was the moment when the patient looked at himself in the mirror and smiled, for the first time in a long time. That was when he understood that he was on the right path. That everything he had experienced, the abandonment, the insults, the pain, was being transformed into something greater. He no longer carried a scar. He carried a mission. Sergio became known among his colleagues as someone tireless, ethical, deeply human. He did not seek recognition. He just wanted to live up to what Maria believed he would be. Because deep down, he was still that rejected boy who just wanted to be seen as someone worthy of love. In one of his presentations, in his last year of training, he defended a thesis on how the emotional support of the patient directly influences post-surgical recovery. He received a standing ovation. A professor approached him and said, "You are not just a future doctor. You are a curator of stories." Sergio smiled, thanked her, but did not respond. He just thought of Maria, of her firm voice saying, "You will still be great, my son." And he was, just not in the way others measure greatness. The diploma in his hand trembled, not from fear, but from memory. At that ceremony, surrounded by applause and smiling colleagues, Sergio felt the weight of everything he had left behind. There was no family in the audience, no banner with his name on it, just himself, standing with the silent conviction that he had overcome the impossible. A few days later, now a resident physician, Sergio was assigned to a special program for patients with severe disfigurements. It was a difficult area where most cases involved serious accidents, domestic violence, or rare skin diseases. But it was there that he felt complete. In one of his first weeks, he received a patient who had suffered a chemical attack. The woman, who had previously been vain and smiling, now hid herself from everything and everyone. Sergio looked at her calmly, listened slowly, and said in a low voice, "I know what it's like not to want anyone to see you. But I'm here to help you see yourself again." These words left an impression on the woman. She cried, but she accepted the treatment. And after months of surgeries and follow-up, she smiled again. Not because her face was the same as before, but because she had been welcomed with dignity. This was Sergio's true specialty, restoring more than just skin. His name began to circulate among professionals and patients, not only for his technical talent, but for something rare, true compassion. Important people began to seek him out. Businessmen, actors, public figures. But he never gave up on the free services at community clinics. He never forgot where he came from. It was at one of these clinics that fate arranged his first reunion with the past. An elderly man arrived, accompanied by a friend, asking for urgent help. His face was covered in a skin disease that was progressing rapidly, causing deep wounds. He was unrecognizable. When the patient removed the scarf from his face, Sergio froze. His eyes, even with time, were the same. Bruno Silva. his biological father, the man who had abandoned him for being too ugly. Now he was the one asking for help to recover his face. Inside, everything in Sergio trembled. The memory of the hospital in Boston came to him, the rain that night, the look of contempt. He took a deep breath, got up from his chair, and walked to the window. He needed a moment, but he didn't leave. He came back, looked Bruno in the eyes, and said calmly, "Mr. Silva, I can help. But I want you to know that we already know each other." The man took a few seconds. He observed that doctor with a firm voice, a scar on his face, and an intense gaze. And then he understood. He remained silent. He did not apologize. Sergio could have refused him. He could have humiliated him. But he decided to treat him. Not for him, but for himself. Because sometimes it's not about who hurt us. It's about who we decide to be, even after everything. The treatment lasted weeks. Bruno got better, but the distance between the two was never bridged. Sergio maintained his professionalism. He did his best, but he did not offer bonds, because bonds are built with love, and love he never received from that man. When the treatment was over, Bruno left the clinic without saying a word. No apology, no gesture of regret. Sergio just watched, and when he closed the office door, he did not feel angry. He felt relief. Relief for having chosen not to be the same. Relief for having done the right thing. Relief for proving to himself that healing is a path that begins within. The news spread quickly among his colleagues. The renowned surgeon who had reconstructed the face of a disfigured man was, in fact, the son he had abandoned years ago. Some were shocked. Others, in silence, simply admired Sergio's attitude even more. But he didn't want admiration. He didn't want his past to become headline news. He asked his colleagues to keep a secret. What he had done, he did out of conscience, not for attention. And if he could, he would have moved on without ever crossing that man's gaze again. But fate had other plans. A week later, he received an envelope in his office. There was no return address. Inside, a handwritten letter. It was from Corinne, his biological mother. Confused words, somewhere between guilt and pride, said that she had found out about everything and wanted to see him. Sergio read each line carefully. She said she was sick, alone. She said she deeply regretted what she had done, but she hadn't had the courage to look for him until now. She asked for forgiveness, but didn't demand anything. She just said that if he hated her, he would understand. For a moment, Sergio closed his eyes. He felt the old pain throbbing again. The hunger, the abandonment, the cold, the childhood marked by contempt. But he also felt Maria's presence. It was as if she were there, saying in a calm voice, "You know what to do." He decided to go. Not for the mother he never had, but for the man he had become. He found Corinne in a simple house on the outskirts of Baltimore. She was thin, pale, with short hair, her face marked by illness. When she saw him, she put her hands to her chest and cried. He stood still. He didn't know whether to hug her or speak. So he just looked. She tried to explain herself between sobs and regrets. She said she had been weak, that she had let Bruno decide everything, that she had never been the same after that. She had been looking for him for years, but had never had the courage to show herself. Sergio listened, in silence. At one point, she asked him to sit next to her. She showed him a box with old photos. One of them was of him a newborn. And there, for the first time, Sergio saw something he had never imagined, his mother holding him tenderly before everything fell apart. The image shook him, because as much as he wanted to stay strong, he was still her son. It still hurt. There was still an empty space that, for a second, almost filled up. But he knew. It wasn't about starting over. It was about closure. He spent a few hours with her. They talked. He told her part of his story, without going into too much detail. She listened with teary eyes, repeating softly that she never imagined he would survive all that, and that, even though she didn't deserve it, she was grateful he had come. When he left that house, Sergio didn't feel peace or anger. He felt reality, because forgiveness isn't a button you press. It was a long road full of twists and turns, but at least he had taken the first step. That night, he returned home, opened a drawer, and took out Maria's old photo. He looked at it for a few minutes. Then he put the photo inside the envelope where Corinne's letter was. He kept them together, not out of confusion, but out of respect for their story. There, between the past that had hurt him and the memory of the one who had healed him, Sergio understood that he was no longer the rejected boy. He was a whole man, shaped by pain but guided by his choices. He knew that there would still be difficult days, wounds that would not heal so easily. But at that moment, something inside him began to calm down. And for the first time in many years, Sergio slept peacefully. Not because everything had been resolved, but because finally he had found the courage to look back without getting lost in what had remained. The next morning, Sergio woke up before the sun. There was something different in the air. A strange calm, almost silent. He got up slowly, made a strong coffee, and stood in front of the window, watching the still sleeping city. For the first time in a long time, he felt no rush, no heaviness. But that moment of peace was short-lived. The phone rang. It was from the hospital. An urgent call. A serious accident involving a school bus and a truck. Multiple victims, many children. Sergio simply said, "I'm on my way," and left. When he got there, the scene was chaotic. Doctors, nurses, crowded hallways, screams, and the crying of desperate parents. Sergio took a deep breath, put on his lab coat, and went into action. The first patient brought into his room was an 8-year-old girl with a burned face and deep trauma to her eyes. He approached, bent down to her level, and said in the firmest, gentlest voice he could muster, "You're safe now. I'm going to take care of you." The girl didn't respond, but he held her hand tightly. And there, in that simple touch, Sergio remembered Maria. For hours, he operated, not just on the girl, but on so many others. He forgot about time. He forgot about hunger. The only thing that mattered was saving, rebuilding. At the end of that endless shift, when silence once again reigned in the hallways, he sat on the floor of the locker room and cried. He cried not out of pain, but out of humanity. Because that day, something had changed inside him. The child who had once been discarded for not having a pretty face was now saving children so that they would never have to hide like he had. It was as if everything, little by little, made sense. In the following days, he visited the girl again. He brought her books, stories, small joys. Little by little, she began to smile again. A shy, fragile, but genuine smile. When her parents thanked him through tears, saying that he had given their daughter her life back, Sergio just shook his head. He knew that, deep down, she was the one helping him find his own heart again. It was during one of these meetings that something unexpected happened. The girl gave him a drawing. It was simple, 2 little dolls holding hands. One with a scar on his face, the other with a bow in his hair. Below it was written, "You are the doctor who heals from within." Sergio held the paper as if it were gold, and he understood that, even after years of study, surgeries, awards, and recognition, there were still lessons that only a child could teach him. Sometimes the greatest miracle is to be seen as someone who cares. That night, he walked the streets of Baltimore as someone who had found a new purpose. It was not enough to heal visible wounds. The world needed hands that could sew together what pain tore apart inside. That was when he had an idea, a seed, to create an institute, a center for the free treatment of children with deformities caused by accidents, violence, or disease. A space where no one would be rejected because of their appearance, where there would be acceptance and reconstruction of the skin but also of the soul. He spent the following months between surgeries and meetings, seeking support, knocking on doors, convincing businessmen, collecting donations. He didn't want luxury. He wanted dignity. And little by little, what seemed like a dream became a reality. The institute was given a simple name, Casa Maria, a tribute to the woman who loved him when no one else would, to the woman who taught him that beauty is not in the face, but in the gestures. On the day of the inauguration, in front of doctors, journalists, and emotional parents, Sergio didn't give a long speech. He simply said, "My life began when someone believed in me. Today, I want other lives to have this chance too." And then, with tears in his eyes, he cut the ribbon. What had once been pain now opened doors. And those who had once been rejected now welcomed the world. In the first week of operation at Casa Maria, the movement was greater than Sergio expected. Children arrived from various parts of the country, brought by parents who carried in their eyes the same mixture of tiredness and hope. Many had tried other paths, faced endless lines and closed doors. There they found a place where they were not judged, but welcomed. Sergio made a point of knowing each child by name. He walked through the rooms, knelt beside the stretchers, and listened to stories that seemed to come from nightmares. Burns, falls, attacks, accidents, marks that went beyond the skin. On each face, a silent pain begged for more than scalpels. It asked for presence, listening, affection. Among the new patients was a 9-year-old girl named Clara. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. Her fixed eyes seemed locked inside. She arrived accompanied by a social worker who gently explained that Clara had been taken from home after suffering brutal abuse. The abuser? Her own stepfather. Her mother, who had been absent. Sergio felt his stomach turn. He had seen many types of pain. But there was something in that girl's silence that disarmed him. He sat down next to her, picked up a blank sheet of paper, and drew a flower. Then he pushed it toward her, without saying a word. She didn't react, but she didn't turn her face away either. And that, for him, was already a start. In the days that followed, Clara remained silent, but she never refused to see him. She looked at him attentively, as if studying his gestures. Sergio respected her time. He knew that there were pains that could not be rushed. Each visit was a silent attempt to build trust, even if through small gestures. One afternoon, when he entered the room, he found the sheet of paper on the bed. But there was something different, a second flower, drawn next to the first. The lines were uncertain, childish, but it was there. Clara had answered. And at that moment, Sergio felt a lump in his throat. That drawing was more than ink. It was a whispered cry of someone who was slowly beginning to want to live again. From that moment, the connection between the two grew. Clara still couldn't speak, but she was beginning to communicate with her eyes, her gestures, and the drawings she left for him every time she left. And Sergio increasingly understood that he was looking at a broken but not destroyed soul. A child who, even when silent, cried out for help with all the strength she had left. The Institute's team began to pay special attention to the case. Psychologists, therapists, and educators. All of them came together to rebuild something that couldn't be seen in the mirror. Clara began to attend sessions with a psychologist named Anna, who used stories and dolls to access emotions that words couldn't reach. Little by little, her drawings began to have more colors. And one day she drew a house, with open windows. Sergio stuck that drawing on the wall of his office, and he would look at it whenever he felt tired. It was a reminder that new beginnings are possible. That even the deepest abyss can contain a ladder if there are hands willing to reach it. During a meeting with investors, he was asked about the impact of the Institute. He could have given numbers, statistics, and services provided, but he preferred to tell Clara's story, without going into details. Just the essential truth, a wounded child who was regaining confidence. When he finished, there was silence in the room, and tears in the eyes of many. The next day, he received the largest donation since the founding of Casa Maria. Months passed. Clara began attending a nearby school, accompanied by a teacher from the Institute. She still couldn't speak, but she smiled more often. Sometimes, she laughed while watching videos of animals on her tablet. And one morning, when she saw Sergio enter her room, she ran to him and hugged him for the first time. He said nothing. He just knelt down and hugged her back. They stayed like that for a while. And in that shared silence, there was more meaning than in any speech. Because when the pain is deep, even silence can be a cry for healing. It was that same day that Clara said her first word since arriving at the Institute. They were alone organizing pencils and notebooks when she whispered softly, "Thank you." Sergio pretended not to hear. He didn't want to pressure her. But inside something lit up. As if the night was beginning to give way to dawn. Clara's story became a symbol within Casa Maria. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Every professional who entered there knew that they didn't just deal with bodies. They dealt with stories, with traumas, with the fragile hope of those who had once been left behind. And although Sergio continued to operate, save, and direct the institute, there was something about Clara that moved him differently. She was a living reminder that the deepest scars are not on the skin. They are in the soul, and that only love can truly rewrite a destiny. Clara became part of the routine at Casa Maria, as if she had always belonged there. Even though she didn't say much, her presence was felt in the hallways, in the small gestures of care for other children, in the way she drew flowers and open houses, as if she had finally accepted that the world could, indeed, be a safe place. One morning, when Sergio arrived, he found Clara sitting in the waiting room with a small girl on her lap. The little girl was crying, having just arrived after a house fire. Clara didn't say anything. She just stroked her hair, offering a kind of comfort that not even adults could express. It was as if she knew exactly what that pain meant. When he saw the scene, Sergio stopped for a moment, unnoticed. He felt something strong tighten in his chest. Clara, who had once needed to be rescued, was now a shelter for others. That made him realize that healing sometimes happens silently, spreading through gestures that didn't ask for recognition, just continuity. It was Anna, the psychologist, who suggested a new step, allowing Clara to participate in a therapeutic workshop with other children. Drawings clay made up stories, a space where everyone could freely express their pain and dreams. Clara accepted with a shy nod, and to everyone's surprise, she shone in that environment. In the second week of the workshop, Clara created a character called Lua, a magical girl who hid during the day but saved children at night with the touch of her hands. The story was told with enthusiasm in the drawings, with detailed scenes of acceptance, courage, and liberation. Anna understood, without Clara needing to say it, that Lua was a reflection of herself. Sergio started keeping Lua's drawings in a special folder. They were like chapters of a book that was still being written, not just with paper and pencil, but with daily overcoming. And the more Clara spoke, the more he felt that his mission was just beginning. One rainy night, while he was finishing his reports in the office, Sergio received an unexpected visitor. It was Clara's mother. Her eyes were swollen, her body hunched over as if she were carrying too much weight. She said that she had sought treatment, that she had left her stepfather and wanted to see her daughter. But there was too much guilt in her voice, and Sergio knew that words could not erase absences. He listened to her in silence. Then, carefully, he explained that Clara was safe, but that any reunion would have to be built over time, with care, with proof of change, not empty promises. The woman nodded, leaving an envelope with a letter that she asked to be given to her daughter only if she wanted to read it. The next morning, Sergio took the envelope to Clara. He placed it on the table, without saying much. She looked at it, but did not touch it. For days, the paper remained there, like a silent ghost. Until one late afternoon, Clara asked to be left alone in Anna's room. She left hours later, her face calm, but her eyes red. She didn't talk about the content, and Sergio didn't ask. Weeks later, she gave him a new drawing. It was Lua hugging a woman with a blurred face without eyes or mouth. But there was a colorful tear running down the figure's face. Below it was written, "Some people make mistakes. Others learn." It was her way of saying that she was learning to forgive, slowly, but without closing her heart. Meanwhile, Casa Maria gained new arms. Other doctors, psychologists, volunteers. Success stories began to be publicized, inspiring clinics and shelters in other states. Sergio was invited to give lectures, interviews, meetings. But he turned most of them down. He preferred to be there, among the silent stories that didn't fit in the headlines. Clara grew up. At 11 years old, she began to speak naturally. She laughed out loud. She made jokes. And once, seeing a new child when he arrived, he took the initiative to show her the entire institute, like a little guide. Anna said that it was therapeutic, but Sergio knew that it was more, it was a vocation. Clara had discovered a way to give back to the world what she had received. It was on a Saturday afternoon that Clara called him to the cafeteria. She was with a group of children, and a box in her hands. Inside there were several drawings. The moon, the institute, the children, the flowers. "I want to write a book," she said. "I want to tell what I experienced, so that other Claras won't be afraid to ask for help." Sergio held back the urge to cry. He just smiled and nodded. That night, he stared at the ceiling of his room, unable to sleep. He thought about how pain could turn into light, how a wounded girl could become a bridge, how love, even late, could reinvent destinies. Clara was no longer just a patient. She was a symbol, a seed, the miracle itself happening. And in that moment, he understood. Casa Maria was not just a place of healing. It was an altar, a sanctuary built on ruins that refused to be the end of the story. And Clara was the living gospel of that new beginning. Clara's book project quickly turned into something bigger than Sergio had imagined. What began as a timid desire to share her story became a movement within Casa Maria. Children who had previously barely drawn were now asking for paper and colors to express their memories, their fears, and small victories. The workshop became a kind of stronghold of resistance, where pain was welcomed without haste or judgment. Clara wrote with the same intensity that she experienced. She did not use difficult words or memorized phrases, but each line had truth. She talked about the silence in her room, about the fear of looking someone in the eye, about the day she decided to trust again. And she told in delicate detail about the moment when she felt that Sergio's embrace was different, not like that of someone who wanted to save her, but like that of someone who saw who she was. Sergio followed everything from a distance. He read the drafts at the end of the day, with the care of someone holding something fragile. He never corrected them. He would just comment, "This is beautiful, Clara," or "This piece here is pure heart." And she would smile. She was not seeking approval, but she knew that she was heard, seen. And that was enough. The book was ready 3 months later. It was simple, with colorful drawings and honest words. Sergio paid for the printing of the first edition with donations. There was no expectation of sales, only the desire to spread hope. But the unexpected happened. A journalist who was visiting the institute read the book and published an article. Within a few days, Clara became known outside the walls of Casa Maria. Invitations began to arrive. Schools, NGOs, and institutions wanted to hear the girl who had transformed trauma into poetry. Sergio hesitated. He was afraid of the exposure, of the burden it could place on her. But Clara, with the firmness of someone who had already faced the worst, said, "If my pain can prevent others, I want to speak." And he understood. She did not ask for permission. She chose her path. The first lecture took place in a public school. Clara went up on stage wearing a light blue dress and holding a notebook. She read her text in a firm voice. She did not dramatize. She did not cry. She simply told the story. At the end, there was silence. Then applause. And then a girl in the audience stood up and said, "I suffered too. But now I know it's not my fault." And there, Sergio saw something he would never forget, the exact moment when pain turned into liberation. Clara's schedule began to be divided between her studies, Casa Maria, and performances. Sergio made sure she had balance, space to be a child. He often took her to the park or to the movies, away from the cameras, to remind her that, despite everything, she still deserved to live without burdens. Clara laughed, joked, threw popcorn at his head. And in those moments, he felt less like a doctor and more like a father. The relationship between them took on profound contours. There were no blood ties, but something much rarer, recognition of souls. Clara, without asking, had occupied a space that had previously been empty. And Sergio, without realizing it, was building a new way of loving, not the kind that demands, but the kind that remains even in silence. It was Anna who first brought up the subject delicately. "Have you ever thought about formally adopting her?" Sergio remained silent for a while. He was afraid of invading a space that was not his. But Anna continued, "Love does not need paper, but sometimes paper protects love." And he understood. It was not about possession, but about commitment. About not leaving her alone in the world anymore. When he spoke to Clara about adoption, she took a while to respond. She did not say yes or no. She just asked for time. Sergio respected this. For days, she became more introspective. Until one rainy night, she gave him an envelope with a note. "You are already my family. I just want this to last." And inside, there was a sheet of paper with a drawing, two hearts connected by a bridge. The paperwork began the following month. The process was long, full of interviews and evaluations. But no one there doubted the connection between the two. When the judge made the adoption official, Clara was next to Sergio, holding hands, and looked at him with a serene glow. There was no celebration, no shouting. Just a long hug, the kind that seals everything without needing to say anything. Casa Maria celebrated with a simple afternoon coffee. The children made posters, and Anna read a short text in tribute to the two. Clara seemed lighter, as if, by finally having a home, she could rest inside. Sergio did too. For the first time in a long time, he felt that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. That night, lying on the couch, Clara fell asleep on his chest, holding one of the books they had written together. Sergio looked at the ceiling, as he had done so many times before, but this time without questions, without emptiness. Only gratitude. And silently, he promised himself that he would protect that love with everything he had. Because now, more than ever, he knew healing was a path that was walked together. Life with Clara brought new routines, but also new silences. Sergio learned that love was not about grand gestures, but about being there. About making breakfast even without words, about sitting on the couch and sharing the same silence without needing to fill it. Clara, in turn, learned to trust in permanence. There was no longer any fear of waking up and discovering that it had all been a dream. But not every day was easy. Clara still had nightmares. Sometimes she would wake up in the middle of the night with her face wet with sweat, her eyes wide open, searching for something she couldn't name. At those times, Sergio didn't ask. He would just sit next to her, offer his hand, and wait for her breathing to return to normal. He knew that some wounds no longer bled, but they still hurt. As the months went by, Clara's invitations to speak at events became more frequent. Schools, institutions, and even medical conferences wanted to hear the girl who healed with words. But Sergio realized when this began to weigh on them. She was still a child. A strong child, yes, but still growing. They had to be careful not to let the applause become a burden. That's when they decided to stop. For a while. A retreat, as Clara called it. No lectures, no cameras, no commitments. Just the two of them, some books, walks in the open air. They rented a small house in the countryside where the sound of birds replaced the sound of sirens. Clara walked barefoot, picked flowers, and wrote poems that she left on the windows. One of those afternoons, sitting by the river, Clara talked about what she feared most. It was no longer her stepfather, nor the past. It was forgetting who she was before everything. Sometimes I'm afraid of becoming just a story of overcoming and losing the Clara who only wanted to play with dolls. Sergio understood. He promised to help her preserve that part, because she didn't have to be an example all the time. She could just be. When she returned to the city, something inside them had changed. It wasn't an escape, it was a conscious return. Clara started attending school more regularly, made friends, and discovered that she liked theater. She went on stage as if it were her secret home. She played characters with such truth that she even moved teachers. When asked how she did it, she would answer, "I only speak from the heart." Sergio, on the other hand, immersed himself in new projects at Casa Maria. He created an internal mentoring program for the children. The older ones helped the younger ones. Clara, without being officially appointed, became a kind of godmother of the project. The children sought her out spontaneously, not out of obligation, but because they knew she understood without having to explain. One morning, a new case arrived at the institute. A 9-year-old boy, mute since the fire that destroyed his home. The medical team did what they could, but it was Clara who managed to get close to him. She sat next to him, offered him pencils and paper, and there, amidst drawings, the two of them constructed their own language. Soon he began to smile. Then he ventured a word, and the first was home. That day, Sergio cried. Not out of sadness, but out of reverence. It was as if Clara had discovered a gift that went beyond speech, beyond books. She touched what no one saw, and that could not be taught. It was a gift, and it was also a choice. Time passed, and the institute grew. New professionals arrived, new hands joined in. But the essence remained the same, a space where visible and invisible wounds were treated with the same care, where no one needed to hide their pain. And Sergio, even amidst his responsibilities, made a point of continuing to serve, listen, and be present. One night, Clara found an old box in Sergio's closet. Inside, there were photos from a time when he still hid his face, newspaper clippings, old letters. She looked at everything with respect. Then, she sat down next to him and said, "You saved me with your scar, because it taught me that beauty is not the absence of pain, is the courage to carry on even when wounded." Sergio held her hand, and in that gesture, he understood that his mission was never to erase pain, but to transform it. That each life touched was a reminder that everything he had experienced, each rejection, each tear, now found meaning. Clara was not just a child of destiny. She was a bridge between what he was and what the world could still be. On Casa Maria's birthdays, Clara made a point of preparing posters with the children. There were simple cakes, games, improvised songs. There was no luxury, but there was laughter. There was belonging. Every corner of the institute carried memory and promise. It was sacred ground, built with tears and hope. On the eve of the adoption anniversary, Clara left a note on Sergio's pillow. "You didn't just give me a home. You taught me how to rebuild my name. And in your embrace, I am whole." He kept the note in his wallet, next to the first drawing she had given him. That night, while Clara slept and the city fell silent, Sergio stood in front of the window, just like that first day. But now there was no emptiness. There was history. And above all, there was love. A love that was not announced in words, but that made itself a home every day. Helena's arrival at Casa Maria was not announced urgently, but all it took was a look into her eyes to understand that she was carrying a silent cry. She was 11 years old, her body too small for her age, and an expression of someone who had aged too soon. She was brought by a social worker after being rescued from captivity, where she lived for months in silence, subjugated by a man who claimed to be her protector. Sergio watched her from afar during the first few days. Helena didn't speak. She didn't cry. She just stared at the floor and ate slowly, as if she was afraid that the food would be taken away at any moment. Her body was hurt, but what was most striking was the way she avoided any touch, as if the simple gesture of an outstretched hand was a threat. Clara was the first to approach her. She knew what silence was. She knew what fear was. She sat next to the girl without saying anything. For 3 days in a row, she brought her a piece of paper and a pencil. She didn't ask for a drawing. She just left it there within reach. On the 4th day, Helena scribbled. Crooked, confusing lines, but it was a start. A thread of voice in the midst of the trauma. Sergio then understood that the girl needed more than surgery or medication. She needed time, to be listened to, and to be present. He started visiting her every day, always at the same time. She carried a book with her, but she rarely opened it. She stayed there available. Sometimes she would let slip some silly story from her childhood. Other times he spoke of the sky, the stars, the things that seemed distant but were constant. One day Helena spoke, not with words, but with a gesture. She held out the drawing she had made. It was a face with closed eyes and colorful tears falling. When Sergio looked at her, she murmured, "Does crying have color too?" His throat tightened, but he answered sweetly, "Yes, it does. Sometimes blue, sometimes red, sometimes gold. It depends on what we keep inside." It was from then on that Helena began to open up. Slowly, with pauses. She told things in fragments, like someone who stitches together painful memories. Clara remained close by, not as a caregiver, but as an equal presence. They created a silent bond, an alliance between survivors. Sometimes a look between the two was enough for the world around them to lose its urgency. Sergio knew he couldn't promise Helena that everything would be okay. He had already learned that good was often imperfect, full of scars. But he could guarantee that she wouldn't be alone. And that, at that moment, was everything. It was more than she had ever had. Over time, the girl began to smile. Rarely, but when she did, it lit up the hallway. Helena's story reached a journalist who was already following Casa Maria's projects. She wanted to write a story, but Sergio refused. He said it wasn't the right time, that the world didn't need another tragic headline. It needed space for healing. The journalist understood. And for the first time, she wrote an article without a name, without a face, just with feelings. It was one of the most read articles of the year. Helena started attending theater workshops with Clara. At first, she would stay in the back, watching. Then she would rehearse a line, then another. And when she finally went on stage, playing a girl who finds her voice again, there were tears. Not from the audience, but from the children themselves. Because they knew. They felt. It was more than acting. It was liberation. Sergio watched everything with a heavy heart. Not because of the pain, but because of the beauty. With each child that blossomed, it was as if a forgotten part of a world was being rebuilt. Not with grand speeches, but with small gestures, a pencil, a lap, a stage. Things that seemed too small to change lives. But they did. One afternoon, while Clara and Helena were preparing a poster for presentation, Clara said, "Sometimes I think that everything we went through was to get here." Helena replied in a low but firm voice, "Or to help those who haven't arrived yet." Sergio heard that from the hallway, unseen. He stood there, feeling the weight and lightness of each word. Casa Maria began to receive letters from all over the country. Parents, educators, teenagers. Many reporting abuse, many asking for guidance, others simply thanking them for existing. Sergio then understood that the mission of the Institute was not only to treat physical wounds, but to become a beacon for those who were lost in pain. And despite everything, Sergio was still the same man who woke up early, drank strong coffee, and watched the world through the window. The difference was that now he saw more. He felt more. Because he had learned with every child that being strong is not about not crying. It is about continuing to love, even after being broken. That night, as the Institute closed, Clara walked beside him in silence. Helena followed close behind, holding a folder with drawings. As she passed the hallway of photos, where each child left a smiling portrait, Helena stopped. She looked at her own recent photo and said, "Maybe I'm turning into color." Sergio looked at her tenderly, and he replied in a low but certain voice, "You always were. You were just hidden behind the gray." The following spring, Casa Maria received its largest donation since its founding. An anonymous businessman, upon reading the journalist's article about the girl with no name, decided to finance the construction of a new wing at the Institute. He didn't ask for credits or publicity. He simply asked that it be a space for silence, art, and reconnection. A place where children could relearn to feel without fear. Sergio was moved, not by the amount, but by the gesture. He knew that, in the world they lived in, donations often came with interests. But this one came clean, like a breath of fresh air. And perhaps for this reason, they decided to call the new space Room of Beginnings. Because there, everything could start over again, as many times as necessary. During the construction, Clara and Helena oversaw every detail. They chose the colors, the books, the instruments. They made sure to put cushions on the floor, shelves within reach, and a mural where each child could leave a sentence or drawing. It was a space built with memories, but focused on the future. And, in a way, it was a reflection of themselves. The inauguration was intimate. No press, no speeches. The children sat on the floor in a circle, and each one was invited to say a word that represented a new beginning. Helena, now with a brighter look in her eyes, was the last to speak. Her word was truth. And in the silence that followed, no one dared to interrupt. Because there, in that little speech, there was a whole world. In the following weeks, the Room of Beginnings became the heart of the Institute. There people cried, created, spoke, or remained silent. There were no fixed rules, only respect. And that was where a new child arrived. Samuel, 7 years old, fatherless, and with a mother in serious condition after a suicide attempt. His eyes carried a silent urgency, a fear of disappearing as if he had never existed. It was Clara who sat next to him, as she had done with Helena. She didn't talk about pain or the past. She just started drawing. Samuel didn't answer on the first day, or on the second, but on the third, he picked up a pencil and drew a circle. When Clara asked what it was, he said, "A hole that lives in my chest." And then, without knowing, he began to heal. Sergio observed everything with reverence. He didn't interfere, he just supported. He had already learned that there are pains that can't be solved with a scalpel. There are wounds that need affection, time, and safe spaces. And that was what he dedicated himself to offering, even when the world outside insisted on running faster than souls could handle. One cloudy afternoon, Clara had a crisis. Not because of anything specific, but sometimes the past came back in the form of tiredness. He stayed in his room, unwilling to talk. Helena came in slowly, sat on the floor, and stayed there. For hours. As night fell, Clara whispered, "Do you think that one day we will just be normal?" Helena calmly replied, "Maybe we never will be. But being normal has never cured anyone." Those words stayed with Sergio for days, because they were true. He thought about how many years he had spent trying to be acceptable, ordinary, invisible. And it was precisely when he accepted his uniqueness, with all that it hurt, that he began to heal others. Normality, he realized, was a dangerous myth. What saved him was the truth. Over time, Samuel started to smile again. He played in the yard, asked questions about the stars, and said that when he grew up, he wanted to build a house with a roof made of hugs. Clara laughed when she heard that. Helena, serious as always, replied, "We're already building it, only on the inside." And that's when Sergio realized that those children weren't just being saved. They were saving. In an internal meeting, a new psychologist at Casa Maria commented, "What impresses me most here isn't the methods. It's the affection transformed into structure." Sergio thanked her in silence, because he knew that that place only existed because one day he was welcomed by someone who loved his pain as if it were a flower. And now, he was just repeating that gesture on a larger scale. One night, when closing the gates of the Institute, Clara called him to show him something. It was the mural in the beginnings room. A new phrase had been pasted by an anonymous child. "Here I discovered that I can exist completely." Sergio touched the paper carefully, as if he were touching a soul. Then he returned home in silence, carrying within himself the strength of that message. The next morning, he woke up with a thought that wouldn't leave his mind. What if Casa Maria could train educators to replicate that in other cities? Not hospitals, but spaces for listening, art, and presence. Places where the invisible was treated as real. Because he knew, pain can arise in many places, but so can healing. While he was drinking his coffee in front of the window, as he did every morning, Sergio felt something new. It wasn't peace. It was purpose. Because now, more than ever, he understood, every life that passed through his path left a piece. And with those pieces, he was stitching together a possible world. The following week, Sergio called an extraordinary meeting with the entire Casa Maria team. He brought with him a map spread out on the table, marking small towns in the interior that didn't have any kind of psychological care or assistance for victims of childhood trauma. There was a restlessness in his eyes, but also a sparkle that no one had seen since the founding of the Institute. He explained his idea calmly. He wanted to create mobile centers, small traveling units that would take the spirit of Casa Maria to places where there was nothing else. Not hospitals, but living centers of listening and affection, in adapted trucks with psychologists, storytellers, conversation circles, art, and support. Where there is silence, let us bring a voice, he said firmly. The team was silent for a few seconds, until Clara, moved, replied, "Let's bring the beginning to those who never had a beginning." And then everyone agreed. They knew it would be difficult, that it would involve logistics, investment, sacrifice. But they also knew that if anything could change the world, it was the courage to see the invisible. While the plans were taking shape, Helena began to write letters. Not to send, but to keep. They were letters to herself, to the past, to the girl who once believed that the world only knew how to hurt. Sergio read one of them, with permission. Dear me, surviving is not the end. Is the ground where we learn to plant. He said nothing. He just hugged the girl in silence. Samuel, in turn, wanted to draw the trucks. Each one with a different name. Caminho do Obraco, Todo do Cuidado, Rota da Escuta. His imagination was so vivid that it even infected adults. Clara smiled and said, "This boy was born from the ashes and already wants to build stars." Sergio just nodded, proud. When the first truck was ready, painted blue with colorful details by the children of Casa Maria themselves, a simple ceremony was held. There were no distinguished guests or photographers. Just the team, the children, and the certainty that they were doing something necessary. Helena put her hand on the vehicle and whispered, "Go slowly, there's a heart inside." The initial route included 3 small towns where child abuse rates were high, but reports were rare. Places where pain was buried out of shame or fear. Upon arrival, the team set up tents, called the schools, offered reading circles, and support sessions. At first, the residents looked at them with suspicion. Later, they cried with gratitude. In one of these towns, a girl named Bia approached Clara with a drawing, a house with open windows. "That's where I wanted to live," she said. And for the first time in a long time, Clara felt that her pain served as a bridge. He looked into the girl's eyes and said, "You can. Your home begins within you." And at that moment, the two understood each other without another word. Sergio wrote reports at night, detailing each experience, each story, each impact. But more than numbers, they were testimonies. Of lives reunited. Of silences broken. Of children who, when seen, began to see themselves too. And he realized that the more he gave, the more he rebuilt himself. One night, Helena came into his office with a question. "Do you think we can save everyone?" He thought for a few moments before answering, "No. But we can make sure that no one has to save themselves alone." She smiled. And in that smile there was more maturity than in many adults. Over time, other professionals began to volunteer. Psychologists, artists, educators. People who had also experienced painful experiences and wanted to transform their wounds into tools. Casa Maria became a kind of invisible school of healing. It didn't teach formulas. It taught presence. On one of the trips, the truck parked in a community where domestic violence was a collective secret. The conversations were intense. The tears were abundant. But at the end of the 3rd day, a woman approached Sergio and said, "You arrived before the police. And you arrived with a hug." He never forgot those words. Upon returning to the headquarters, Clara proposed something new, recording testimonies, not for publication, but for archiving, like memory capsules, so that future generations would know that, even in dark times, someone dared to listen, welcome, rebuild. Sergio agreed, and thus was born the Archive of Hope. That night, he walked through the empty corridors of the Institute, passing by the photos, the drawings, the phrases pasted on the walls. And he understood clearly that that place was already bigger than him. It was a living, pulsating organism, the fruit of much pain, but also of many encounters. And as he turned off the lights, he murmured to himself, "As long as there is darkness, we will be a lantern." The following month, a letter arrived at Casa Maria with no sender. The envelope was simple, with shaky handwriting. Inside, just a sheet of paper with a few words. "If I had known this place 10 years ago, my daughter would still be alive." Sergio read it as if he had been punched in the chest. He folded the paper carefully and put it in his drawer, along with the things that would never be forgotten. That night, he couldn't sleep. He walked around the porch of the Institute trying to understand how far the pain could reach. The absence of that invisible girl, referred to only as my daughter, hurt as if she were known. And perhaps that was it. Every lost child carried within them a piece of all the others that could still be saved. The next day, Sergio shared the letter with Clara and Helena. They read it in silence. Clara, with her eyes lowered, murmured, "The pain that we don't hear turns into mourning before its time." And at that moment, they decided that no pain would be ignored, even if it only came as a whisper. That was when the idea of creating the Corridor of Absence came about. A space in Casa Maria with names, phrases, and drawings of children who were never saved. Not as a somber memorial, but as a living reminder that every absence counts. Helena suggested that the space have soft music and mirrors, so that we can see ourselves, even when the pain wants to hide everything. The project divided opinions. Some thought it was too heavy, others necessary. Sergio was firm. Denying pain doesn't protect anyone. What protects is giving a name, color, and listening to what has been silenced. And so, slowly, that corridor began to take shape, not with deaths, but with absences lived with respect. Clara drew a tree at the end of the hallway. Instead of leaves, each branch had a word written by someone who had experienced loss: courage, longing, anger, hope, name, absence, hug. And when the tree was finished, Helena placed a small plaque next to it. Here, what has left also remains. At the inauguration of the space, Sergio did not give a speech. He simply walked slowly down the hallway, as if visiting a sacred field. When he reached the tree, he knelt down for a moment, touched one of the branches with his fingertips, and closed his eyes. It was his way of saying, "I hear you." From that day on, Casa Maria began to receive more letters. Many were unsigned, with only fragments of stories. As if, upon learning that there was a place where pain was not denied, people gained the courage to tell what they had previously kept in absolute silence. And each letter was read. None fell into the void. Helena began to organize them in themed boxes. Those of silence, those of fear, those of almost. And he said that one day they might turn it into a book, not to sell, but to remember. Clara agreed. It will be the book of the voices that no one heard. Sergio just smiled. He knew that they already understood more about healing than many professionals he had met in his life. On a cold afternoon, Samuel handed Sergio a new drawing. It was Casa Maria with wings. "It flies now, doctor." Sergio asked where it was flying, and Samuel answered firmly, "Where we can't walk." And at that moment, Sergio knew that there was no limit to what they were building. Later that same day, a woman arrived at the Institute's gate. She was carrying a child in her arms, wrapped in blankets. Her eyes were red from suppressed crying. "I heard about it here. They told me that you don't judge." Sergio received her calmly, without questions. He welcomed the child and invited her in. She was trembling, but she did. Clara watched from a distance. She recognized that look, that fear of being exposed, of not being worthy of care. She approached calmly, handed the child a toy, and whispered, "Here we start slowly." The woman burst into tears. And in the midst of her tears, it was possible to hear, "I thought my son would never be seen." In the following days, the child was welcomed like all the others. He began to frequent the beginnings room, to play with Samuel, to laugh slowly. And the mother, little by little, started to stay too. She sat on the bench in the shade, listened to the stories, drank the coffee that was offered. And one day she said, "Maybe what I needed most was a place where I could also be a child for a few minutes." That night, Clara, Helena, and Sergio stayed up late, in silence, sitting in the courtyard. They didn't plan anything. They just breathed, because they knew that, in order to continue welcoming the world, they also needed to remember to take care of each other. And so, even without words, they swore they would continue. Not out of obligation, but because they had become part of what they were healing. On the morning that marked the 2-year anniversary of Casa Maria, Sergio woke up before the sun. There was a different silence, not that of a sleeping city, but the silence that precedes something profound. He dressed slowly, as if preparing for a ritual, and walked to the courtyard. There he sat alone. The cold wind touched his face, and his memory, silent, began to revisit everything they had experienced. The faces returned one by one. Helena's when she first arrived, without saying a word. Clara's, on the day she decided to tell her story. Samuel's, with his eyes shining at the first drawing accepted. And so many others, each carrying with them an entire world, silent and torn, now stitched together with invisible threads of love and time. Helena found him there in silence. She sat down next to him without asking anything. She just leaned her shoulder against his and stayed. Then Clara came, bringing 3 mugs of hot coffee. It was an unspoken ritual between them. On difficult times, it was enough to be together. Too many words could get in the way of what silence knew best. 2 years, Helena said softly. Sergio nodded. But it seems like a lifetime. Clara, looking at the horizon, added, or maybe several lives that began here. It was true. Their lives didn't just continue. They began again. And time in that place had a different rhythm, deeper, more human. In the afternoon, they organized a discreet meeting. No parties, fireworks, or press. Just the children, the professionals, and the volunteers. Everyone sat in a circle in the garden, sharing stories of gratitude and longing. Samuel asked to speak. Holding a sheet of paper in his hands, he said, "I wrote this for today." And he began to read a simple but firm text. Casa Maria is a house that repairs the sound of the heart. Many cried, not out of sadness, but out of recognition. It was as if, at that moment, everyone understood that they were not just saving others, they were saving themselves. And this silent understanding united them in a way that not even time could undo. When night fell, Sergio was alone again in the courtyard. He looked up at the dark sky and remembered Maria, the woman who welcomed him when no one else would, who saw beyond the scars. He took out his cell phone and opened an old photo, the 2 of them on the porch, smiling. He whispered, "See, Maria? The pain has become a home." The next day, a new case arrived. A 14-year-old girl brought by a social worker. She had marks on her arms, eyes, and soul. Helena was the first to approach her. She sat down next to her in the hallway and waited. She didn't ask anything. She just offered her a warm bread roll and waited. After 20 minutes, the girl accepted. She didn't speak, but she ate. It was the beginning. Clara accompanied the young girl to the water room, one of the spaces of silence and welcome created for those who still couldn't express themselves with words. She left her there, sitting among cushions, while soft music filled the air. When she left, she said to Sergio, "She carries the weight of someone who doesn't know if she's worthy of existing." For weeks, the young girl didn't say her name. She just looked, listened, and breathed in the atmosphere. But she didn't leave, and that said a lot. Little by little, she started drawing. First scribbles, then shapes, then human figures. Helena noticed that she always drew girls with giant eyes. "She wants to be seen," she commented. One day, Clara found a folded piece of paper on the table in the art room. It said, "If you had found me before, maybe I would still know how to smile." And below it, "But now I think I'll learn again." It was the first time the girl had written anything. It was her way of saying, "I'm here." Sergio read it and couldn't hold back the tears. Not of pain, but of hope. Because he realized once again that the greatest miracle of Casa Maria was not healing. It was allowing life to be born again where it seemed impossible. And this girl, even without knowing it, was already part of the invisible tree that grew in that place. Clara suggested that, from then on, the walls of Casa Maria would also be a space for the children to express themselves. Let's let them paint, write, and paste phrases. The house needs to breathe with them. The proposal was accepted with enthusiasm. And in the following weeks, the hallways were filled with colors, words, and dreams. In the center of the courtyard, Samuel painted a phrase in large letters with blue paint. Here, pain becomes a bridge. And Helena, as she passed by, stopped for a moment. She lightly touched the words with her hand and whispered, "And we learned to cross over." The following week, Sergio received an unexpected call. It was from a journalist who had heard about Casa Maria through one of the mothers who had been sheltered. He wanted to do a story. He said it was for a large media outlet with national coverage. Sergio hesitated. They weren't looking for fame. They were looking for silence, care, and transformation. But something in his voice said it could be different. "I want to tell what you do, without taking the soul out of it." With a divided heart, Sergio spoke to Clara and Helena. The decision was collective. If it was to show the truth, not in the form of spectacle, but as a seed, they would accept it. And so, they prepared the environment. Not to show perfection, but to show the truth. The raw beauty of daily reconstruction. The journalist arrived on a rainy afternoon. His eyes were attentive but respectful. He walked through the spaces, talked to the children, listened to their stories. He didn't ask any invasive questions. He just listened. Helena watched from afar, always ready to interrupt if something got out of tune. But there was no need. He seemed to understand what was sacred there. The longest conversation took place with Clara. Sitting on the back porch, she talked about her scars. Not the ones on her body, but the others, the ones that no one sees. She told him about the day she arrived at Casa Maria, still in pieces, and how she found the first step back in the welcoming silence. The journalist just listened, and at a certain point, tears ran down his eyes. Undisguised. The article was published 3 weeks later. It had the simple title, Where Pain Learns to Breathe. No images of the children, just photos of the spaces, of the hands at work, of the drawings on the walls. But the words touched deeply. And in a few days, Casa Maria became a symbol. People from all over the country began to write, call, visit. Sergio was scared at first. He was afraid that the essence would be lost. But it was Clara who reassured him, when truth is what guides, light does not confuse. It shows the way. And she was right. The people who came were not coming out of curiosity. They came because something inside them also needed to be welcomed. Among the visitors, an unexpected name came up. Dr. Eliza, one of the greatest experts in pediatric neurosurgery in the country. She called personally. She said she had read the article and was moved. She wanted to meet, collaborate, be there. Sergio could hardly believe it. But when she arrived, she was just a woman with humble eyes and hands ready to help. Eliza didn't ask for anything. She simply put on her lab coat and got to work. She operated, listened, taught. And one day, after a delicate surgery, she said to Sergio, "Here, medicine becomes whole again. Because it doesn't just take care of the body, but the sense of being alive." And at that moment, he felt that Casa Maria was growing not only in size, but in depth. As the number of patients increased, new wings were built. Care was always taken to ensure that the environment did not lose its soul. Each room was named after a child who had left their mark. The art room was called Samuel. The reading room was called Lucia. The emergency reception room was called Clara. And all of them carried vivid memories. One day, Clara found a boy hiding behind the message board. He was shaking. He had arrived that day in silence with his grandmother. She knelt down next to him without asking anything. She simply said, "I hid too." The boy looked at her suspiciously, then curiously. And then finally he asked, "Did you leave there?" She answered with serene firmness, "I did. But not alone. Someone waited for me outside until I had the strength to leave." And then she held out her hand. "Do you want me to wait for you too?" The boy did not respond with words, but he held her hand. And in that gesture, Clara recognized the miracle of starting over. That night, Sergio wrote in his diary, "What we do here is not great, is delicate. It is not a miracle in the religious sense. It is presence. And sometimes that saves more than any surgery." He kept each word as if he were archiving invisible treasures. At the end of the month, they organized a circle around the tree of word branches. Each person could write a new word and hang it up. Samuel wrote wind. Helena, healing. Clara, waiting. And Sergio, after much thought, wrote simply, to remain. Because he knew that more than growing, the hardest thing was to continue. When everyone had left, he stood there, watching the words sway in the breeze. And he understood. That house was not made of bricks. It was made of everything the world used to ignore. And now there, it blossomed in the form of affection. Autumn brought a different wind to Casa Maria. It was not just the weather. It was as if an invisible change was about to happen. Clara felt it in every detail, in the way the leaves fell, in the dense silence of the hallways, in the eyes of the children who seemed to carry secrets. That week, a letter arrived. handwritten on aged paper. No sender. Just shaky handwriting and a sentence on the outside of the envelope for those who understand new beginnings. Helena was the one who found it. She read it carefully, then took it to Sergio in silence. The letter told the story of a woman. It didn't say her name. It just said that one day she too needed a place where pain could kneel, that she felt fear, shame, anger, that she spent sleepless nights trying to forget what could not be erased. And that one day she heard about Casa Maria but didn't have the courage to go in. She described how she would pass by it every day on the other side of the street just to see the tree with the word branches swaying. She said that it sustained her, as if even without going in, she could receive a little of that peace. And now, years later, he was writing to say thank you, because even without knowing it, Casa Maria had saved his life. Sergio read the letter in silence. Then he passed it on to Clara, who started crying before she even finished reading it. That was it. That was why. For moments like this. For lives that didn't need to be explained or shown. They just existed, even if on the sidelines, even if from afar. So they decided to do something new. A box of words. A space at the entrance where anyone could leave or take a word. Anonymous. Silent. A simple but powerful gesture. Because sometimes all someone needs is the right word at the right time. The idea blossomed. Children began to write notes to strangers. You can still. It's not your fault. Your silence is also a way of saying. Words that seemed to spring from the very soul of the house. And soon, people from outside began to write too. A man left a crumpled piece of paper with just 3 words, "I've started dreaming again." A young woman wrote, "Today I breathed without guilt." There was so much life in those notes that the box became an altar. An altar of living words, reminding everyone that the invisible also matters. Helena, who had always been the most reserved, surprised everyone by leaving a note. I stayed. That was all she wrote. But those who knew her knew that it carried decades of battles, falls, and resistance. Clara looked and smiled. Sometimes you don't need to say much to say everything. That same week, a new boy arrived. He was 9 years old and had the hardened look of someone who had seen too much. He didn't speak. He didn't trust. But he spent hours observing the box. On the 3rd day, he took a note, read it slowly, and then put it in his pocket like someone keeping a map. That night, Clara saw him write his first message. "It wasn't me." And he put it in the box. He didn't say anything else. But in that brief outburst, there was the weight of a world. And she understood. Sometimes, what heals is not the explanation. It's just being heard, even without sound. Sergio began to photograph the notes. Not to show the world, but to preserve them. It was like archiving fragments of 1,000 existences that passed by and left a real trail. And so, Casa Maria continued to grow slowly but with roots. And in that autumn of strange wind, they realized, pain can be fertile soil when it is welcomed. And the right word, said at the right time, can change the entire course of a life. Spring arrived as if asking for permission. It brought no celebration or explosions of color. Just a lighter, almost imperceptible air that spread through the corridors of Casa Maria like a whisper of hope. There was something in the atmosphere, as if the pain was learning to breathe along with the season. Sergio started waking up earlier. Not out of obligation, but because he felt that the silence of the early hours held answers that the rest of the day hid. He would sit on the porch with his notebook on his lap and just observe. The wind, the branches, the small noises of a house that never completely slept. It was on one of those mornings that he saw Clara sitting on the floor of the reading room. She was with a new girl who had arrived the day before with her older sister. The girl was holding a book, but she wasn't reading. She just looked at the illustrations as if she were searching for something between the pages. Clara didn't say anything. She was just there. This being was what taught him most at Casa Maria. More than any course, protocol, or theory. It was the presence that healed. The unhurried listening. The silence that didn't pressure. Sergio learned to value this. Trusting in this time that did not follow the world's clock, but the rhythm of wounds. A few days later, the girl from the reading room spoke for the first time. Everyone was gathered in the listening circle when she said quietly, "I like to sing." No one reacted with surprise. Helena simply replied, "We can still like things, even when everything falls apart." From that moment on, music began to gain space. A volunteer appeared brought by Eliza. He played the guitar and said that the notes could open windows into the soul. The children approached with suspicion, then curiosity. Soon the mornings began to be filled with the sound of timid chords and voices that were rediscovering themselves. Clara, surprising even herself, began to sing too. Softly, almost as if apologizing. But her voice came out firm. It was an old song from a forgotten childhood. And when it finished, everyone fell silent. It was as if something had been played, but no one knew what it was. Music became a ritual, not as a distraction, but as an instrument of reconnection. Children who had never allowed themselves to laugh began to sing out of tune. Others invented lyrics. And even Helena, always so restrained, began to clap her hands out of rhythm, eliciting heartfelt laughter. Sergio realized that pain, when it encounters beauty, does not disappear. It transforms. And this transformation was the true miracle. Not the erasure of scars, but the birth of something new from them. It was during this period that they received an unusual request. A school in the city wanted to visit, not to see, but to learn. The teachers had read the report and wanted to understand how to teach with affection, not with fear. Sergio hesitated, but something inside him told him it was time to open another door. They organized a small meeting. Teachers, assistants, and coordinators came with notebooks in their hands and anxious eyes. Clara welcomed them with a simple phrase, "Here, we don't teach you to forget. We teach you to remember carefully." During the visit, a teacher cried when she saw the notes in the word box. She said she had never thought that a child could need to write something for themselves. Sergio listened to her and replied, "It's just that sometimes we write to remind ourselves that we're still here." That school returned several times, and other schools began to look for them too, not to copy the model, but to remember that the essential thing is not in the method, but in the way we look. And that looking with tenderness is the first step towards any healing. And so, without fanfare, Casa Maria began to teach the world, not with speeches, but with the way it welcomed each little piece of humanity that passed by. That night, after the teacher's visit, Clara remained alone on the porch. The lights in the house were still on, but no movement. In her lap, one of the forgotten notes from the box. It was written in childish handwriting, "Does the pain have an end?" She reread it several times, as if listening to an old question echoing inside. There was no ready answer, but there was presence, and she knew that sometimes that was enough. The night breeze touched her face, as if it were caressing her, and Clara thought that maybe the pain doesn't end. Maybe it just changes shape. Maybe she'll learn to walk alongside without hurting so much. The next day, Sergio found Eliza in the cafeteria. She had spent the night in surgery, but she still smiled with tired eyes. She said that the operation had been delicate, but successful. Then she was silent for a while. And then she said, "We learn to deal with physical pain. But the other is up to you." That phrase stayed with him. It echoed in the walls of his soul. The other pain. The one that doesn't bleed on the outside, but corrodes on the inside. That was what Casa Maria intended to touch. And he knew that this required courage. A courage that didn't scream, but remained. It was that same week that a former resident returned. Mariana. She had lived there for 2 years, between the ages of 12 and 14. Now she was 19, and her face was a mix of strength and gentleness. She had come to say thank you. To say she was fine, that she worked in a community library, that she wanted to give back a little of what she had received. Sergio listened in silence. Then he took her to see the reading room. Mariana was moved to see that the name Luzia was still on the door. She touched the name with her fingers as if touching a living memory. And then she said, "It was here that I learned that words can also be hugs." Mariana asked to read to the children. She sat on the carpet, as she had done before. The room filled with small, curious voices. And when she began to read, something happened. It wasn't just the story of the book. It was her presence. A body that said, "Is possible to cross over." After the reading, a girl approached and asked if she had also been scared. Mariana smiled, tucked her hair behind her ear, and replied, "I was so scared that I thought I would never be able to sleep again." The girl nodded, as if she had finally found someone who spoke the same language. Clara watched everything from a distance with teary eyes. Not from sadness, but from gratitude. Because there in front of her was proof that Casa Maria was not just a shelter. It was a seed. And seeds, when well cared for, bloom where you least expect them. In the following days, Mariana came back other times. She helped organize the books, read to the little ones, or simply sat in the garden with someone who needed shared silence. No one asked her for anything, and she did everything as if she had always belonged there. One afternoon, she wrote a note and put it in the box with the words, "Coming back is also moving forward." Sergio read it and kept it with him. He felt that the sentence said a lot about what it really meant to start over. Not to erase the past, but to make peace with it. Mariana's presence awakened something in other former residents. One of them, Ana Paula, sent a letter telling her story. Another, Joanna, sent a video to the children saying that courage doesn't always come shouting. Sometimes it whispers, "Try again." And so, Casa Maria also became a point of return. A place to return to when the world outside got too heavy. A place that didn't demand explanations or success. It just welcomed you. As if to say, you are still welcome. Even with the scars. Especially with them. At the end of that week, Sergio wrote in his diary, "The roots we create here do not bind. They sustain. And that is why even those who leave never truly leave." That morning began differently. Sergio woke up with a deep feeling in his chest. It was neither pain nor joy. It was something else. Something he could not name. He walked through the house in silence, looking at every corner as if saying goodbye, without knowing if it was necessary. In the room of words, he found an old note he had never read. It was yellowed, folded in four. Written by a child who was no longer there. "Here I was someone." Sergio read it quietly. And he understood, once again, the magnitude of what they were building. It was not a work of bricks. It was meaningful. Clara arrived soon after. Her eyes were red. She had dreamed about her mother, a rare thing. In the dream, her mother had told him, "You did what I could not." They hugged each other for a long time, silently. And when Clara woke up, she felt that a part of her had been freed. During coffee, Eliza shared a decision. She was opening a new wing in the hospital where she worked. A space dedicated to the comprehensive care of children with a history of trauma. She would call it Espacio Maria, in honor of the house and everything she had learned there. But before she left, she wanted to leave something. Eliza handed Sergio a small wooden box. Inside were letters she had written to each child she had cared for. They did not contain diagnoses. Just words. Of hope. Of presence, of the future. Because each one needs to take a piece of this light with them wherever they go, she said, her voice breaking. In the following days, Sergio noticed something changing. The house was still alive, full of movement. But there was an air of closure in the air. As if everything was finally finding its place. Helena started writing more. Clara dedicated herself to writing workshops. Mariana helped organize the files. It was then that they decided to hold a celebration. Nothing big, nothing public. Just them. Those who lived, those who stayed, those who came back. A circle in the garden, under the tree of words. No speeches, no formalities. Just presence. In the circle, each person said a word. Not to explain. Just to leave. Like a seed. Helena said silence. Clara chose root. Eliza wrote bridge. Sergio, after several seconds, simply said, "End." But then he smiled and added, "Or maybe beginning." After the circle, they stayed there. Some in silence, others talking quietly. The children ran around the garden as if the whole world could fit in that yard. And, in a way, it did. because there was all the pain transformed into affection, all the absence converted into presence. Mariana took a small photograph from her pocket. It was of her at 13, in the first month in the house. She showed it to Clara and said, "I wanted to forget that girl. Now, I want to protect her." Clara nodded. That was it. The cure was not to erase. It was to embrace what we were in order to continue being. At dusk, a light rain began to fall. It didn't scare anyone. On the contrary, it brought an unexpected peace. As if the sky, too, wanted to say something. And perhaps it did. Because sometimes nature also speaks, but in another language. Sergio went into his room and opened his notebook. He wrote what would be his last note there. Everything we try to teach here is simple. No one should walk alone. And if there is an outstretched hand, a right word, a respected time, then there will be a path. He closed the notebook carefully, and before going to sleep, he went to the bulletin board. He read each note as if looking through an album of invisible photographs, and he thought that perhaps the true construction of Casa Maria was not there inside, but in each person who passed by and followed, different, whole, alive. The story, he knew, did not end there, but something, yes, was coming to an end, and he felt that he was ready to let go, because now there were roots, and where there are roots, there will always be the possibility of blossoming again. The next morning, the house woke up in silence, not a silence of emptiness, but of completeness, like when a book slowly closes and the reader remains there in silence, feeling everything that was experienced between the pages. The sun touched the walls softly, as if blessing what had been built there. Sergio walked slowly to the garden. He sat on the bench next to the tree of words and observed the branches. The ribbons danced with the light wind. There were names, promises, goodbyes, wishes. And there was room for more. There would always be room for more. Clara arrived in silence and sat down next to him. Not a word between the two. Just sharing. The kind of sharing that doesn't need sound. And then she said, "Do you remember when we thought no one would come here?" He laughed with tears in his eyes. "I remember. And look where we are." That day, Helena gave the children blank sheets of paper and asked them, "Draw how you imagine tomorrow." Some drew houses, others skies, some drew themselves bigger. But one girl, named Bia, simply wrote in the center of the paper, "I want to continue feeling what I feel here." That sentence crossed everyone's minds, because in the end, it wasn't about structure nor about time. It was about feeling. About what remains even after the doors close and the names are erased from the papers. It was about presence and the miracle of being remembered for having been cared for. At the beginning of the evening, they made a last circle in the garden. Each one left a symbolic object at the foot of the tree, not to keep, but to trust, as if to say, "This was part of me." A bracelet, a pebble, a button, a drawing. And there, little by little, an altar made of memory was born. Sergio looked at everything and felt he could leave, not from a house, but from a cycle. Clara was ready. Helena was ready. The house itself was ready. And he finally was ready too, because he understood that he didn't need to always be ahead to still be part of the journey. Night fell, and with it came the breeze. The children were sleeping. The adults were putting away the chairs, closing the windows. And then Clara stopped in front of the house's door, looked back and whispered, "Thank you." No one answered, but everything around seemed to welcome that gratitude. Casa Maria was not made to last forever. It was made to remain where it really matters, inside each person who passed through there, because there are places that are not measured by walls, but by marks. And this house, it left marks that time does not erase. The next day, new steps would cross that gate. New stories, new pains, new beginnings. Because the world still has a lot to hurt, but there are also many willing to care. And where there is someone willing to care, there is a chance for healing. The story of Casa Maria ends here, but what it represents continues. In every gesture of listening, in every silent embrace, in every look that does not judge, but welcomes. Because sometimes the greatest miracle is simply being there, staying, waiting, loving the other in their entirety, without demanding repairs. If this story touched you, Share it with someone who needs to remember that there is still hope. Like this video and subscribe to the channel. Here, we do not just tell stories. We spread seeds. Because one day, somewhere, someone may need exactly that, a word, a gesture, a reminder that pain can learn to breathe. And when that happens, may this story be remembered and blossom again.